Welcome to this lecture on biodiversity and land use. First, we're going to start discussing biodiversity concepts that will allow us to understand why it is important for human survival. So first, we're going to start talking about or reviewing the concept of planetary boundaries. And you may be surprised why biodiversity is in one of the planetary boundaries. But if we reflect on this, we can notice that biodiversity have important implications to carbon sequestration and also the water balance or the water fluxes in the earth. So without the living species, everything from vegetation, trees to animals and small insects, pollinators, we will not have biomass, and then therefore we will not have carbon sequestration. Also, in terms of talking about water, the biodiversity or the ecosystems are the drivers of the rainfall patterns, as well as the fluxes in carbon in vegetation due to transpiration and evaporation, etc. Right? But it also regulates, biodiversity also regulates nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus. So it gives a stability to the earth, and that's why it is a planetary boundary. So we're going to discuss in detail what the concept of genetic diversity, because genetic diversity is very important for survival, for food of the world population. So we need the functions and landscapes for pollination and the function of microorganisms in the soil to develop organic matter, which in turn delivers nutrients for plants, and without those we will not have food, for instance. So we need also to explore or to discuss about how much we have influenced biodiversity loss and extinctions. Major extinctions haven't been caused before by humans, but now we're facing what is called the sixth mass extinction, and it is caused by humans. And these dramatic changes can lead to the extinction of our own existence, right? So one example of why there is a great pressure or the threat of our own existence has to do, for instance, with the overfishing in the sea, right? And how much we have done modifications to supply food for populations, and how much this has affected biodiversity. Another planetary boundary that we're discussing here, because of its connection with biodiversity, is land use. So land is converted to human use all over the planet, right? And it's incredible that just over the last 150 years, we have in the situation where 40% of the world's land area into urban regions, and predominantly is also predominant in agriculture, right? And this enormous transition is illustrated through a series of maps showing how land has changed, right, over the past decades. And now it's critical for us to understand how this will affect other factors that we discussed before, also on biodiversity, which are freshwater flows and also nutrients, right? Flow of nutrients. So what we know is that the biomes or the ecosystems are the ones to actually regulate the earth system. And one of the most important ones is forest systems. And we are now at the limit where if we don't preserve these forests, we will also have implications about food supply, and also about this water supply and nutrients, right? The flow of nutrients. So to understand these human challenges, we're going to start defining what is biodiversity. And biodiversity refers to the variability among living organisms from all sources and the ecological complexes of which they are part. Living organisms from all sources include, but are not limited to bacteria, plants, trees, fungi, birds, fish, and vertebrates, right? So this diversity at all organizational levels, ranging from genetic diversity within populations to the diversity of ecosystems in landscapes, contributes to what is called the global diversity. So biodiversity, we're going to have a classification that we're going to start the discussion, and this includes genetic, species, and ecological or ecosystems variety. All right. So we're going to start first discussing genetic diversity. This is a measure of the variety of different versions of the same genes within individual species. To start understanding this concept, let's think about population of dogs or geckos, for instance. So even if we think about, if we look at hundreds of geckos in a single gecko genus, each of those species has its own genetic particular code. It means that it has its own genetic information. Or among the individuals within a species, for instance, we're talking about, if we're looking at the same example, so we have different varieties, right, of geckos, and those all represent genetic diversity. We can see these examples in dogs and in beetles, in many species, but we need to also think about plants and species that are food for humans. How important is that we have genetic diversity on these plants and on these animals? So collectively, the variety or the diversity of genes is what is called the gene pool, and the complete set of genetic information within a population of a given species or within the species itself. The larger the gene pool, the greater the genetic diversity is. And why is it important to have a great genetic diversity? Well, it's because it will increase the chances of the population to survive, or even to flourish in times of environmental change or challenges. And that's because some of the individuals are going to have traits that make them resilient in the face of changes in the environment. So, for instance, they can be more resistant to diseases and more able to survive changes in climate and other threats, right, within the environment. We've already seen that this is due to the way natural selection works, selecting for fitter individuals that pass on their beneficial characteristics. We're going to tie that concept by giving you an example, a very good example of the importance of genetic diversity. So one of the most important examples about genetic diversity or genetic vulnerability comes from the banana. Banana is one of the most popular fruits in the world, and it's planted almost everywhere as long as there is some subtropical environment. But then there was a threat to the banana a long time ago, and it was because there was a disease called Panama disease that started in Australia, and then it expanded to all over the world. It really affected banana crops seriously until the point where these plantations were almost gone. So this disease is caused by a fungi, and this fungi is very difficult to control because it spreads in soil, water, and infects all the planting material. And fungicide application is not that effective. That fungal disease devastated the banana industry in that time. And then later on, what happens is that a new variety came into the world, which was the Cavendish banana. Virtually all the bananas that are sold across the Western world are from this Cavendish group, and these are genetically identical. So it means these bananas are also sterile and dependent on propagation via cloning. So this means that these type of bananas are also very vulnerable, and even if these ones are resistant to that fungi that attacked bananas, a different variety of bananas a long time ago, that doesn't mean that new fungi or microbes can attack this new variety, and we will end up with a crisis, banana crisis all over the world. So what is happening now is that now researchers are trying to look for other varieties to increase this genetic pool and to have more, and also to identify genes that are resistant to diseases, to plant diseases. There are some other examples in the past about growing only or relying on one monoculture. It is not about, this example is not about the same genes. There should have been more gene variety, but it's about growing, just relying on one food source. And this example is the Irish potato famine. So the potato was introduced to Ireland as a garden crop, and then it became very popular to the point where the population started relying on this crop for food supply. But then there was a fungi that attacked these crops, and there was a big famine in Ireland that created even political changes. The studies on genetic biodiversity have greatly improved thanks to the DNA sequencing that has allowed us to have the complete genome of different species. And this has been done in a very easy way through the samples of feathers or fur or feces or any tissue that can allow us to have this material, this DNA material. And thanks to this great progress on genetic analysis, we have been able to identify new species, and we have also been able to remove the definition of endangered species. For example, for the case of gophers in Georgia, where there has been an identification of other gopher with the same gene pool that are genetically identical in other regions. Or we have been able to have a different understanding on how close we are to other species. For instance, we know now that corals and other species like jellyfish and sea anemones are very close to primates as compared to worms and other animals.